Welcome back into the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap, presented by Full Press Coverage. You can find this and other great podcasts on their website. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our podcast and like it and do all those good things. So, Sap, we've talked a lot about the offseason so far. The Lakers have dramatically changed their roster. The Nets have not so much dramatically changed their roster, but made some good improvements on the perimeter. And those teams have not been finished quite yet, as this past week they've both made some more additions in the 35 and older category. I think is the way to put it. Paul Millsap goes to the Nets, and DeAndre Jordan goes to the Lakers by way of the Nets traded him to the Pistons. The Pistons bought him out. He goes to the Lakers. Paul Millsap was just a free agent, so less complicated there. Sap, do you see either of these NBA veterans, I guess is a nice way to say it, playing a big role on either of their new teams?
I'm just waiting for both of these teams to bring back players who are already in the Hall of Fame. You know, there's a 5-year grace period. You get into the Hall of Fame, and if you want, you can come out of retirement and play in the league again. I'm just waiting for that to happen with the Lakers and the Nets, because they just keep adding every single old player in the league. And also LaMarcus Aldridge apparently is coming out of retirement to rejoin the Nets. He got bought out by San Antonio last year and signed with the Nets, had a cup of coffee with them, and then retired because he's had some heart issues. And now he's back. So, you know, these two teams are loading up. I don't think any of these guys will have a real big impact on their teams, other than the fact that they're depth pieces, and it's a long season next year. It's going back to the full 82 games in less than a 6-month period of time. So it's going to be, you know, a very, very intense season. So if these are your 13th or 14th guys on your team, they can fill in. If you want to have other players rest, they can play some minutes. Maybe in the postseason, they can give you 3 or 4 fouls in the case of DeAndre Jordan. If the Lakers are playing the Denver Nuggets in the conference finals, send them out there for 3-4 minutes to lean on Nikola Jokic, whatever. That's what essentially his role will be. And I also think that looking at the Nets, Aldridge played pretty well with them last year, but now he's a year older. And Millsap, I just didn't expect to even be on a team this year. So these are just depth pieces. It could be that they are doing favors to the veterans on the team that are still, you know, high-level players that are friends with these guys. Who the hell knows? But both teams just seem to try to one-up each other, and that's why I think everyone is picking them to meet in the finals.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are getting a little bit too bent out of shape about those most recent additions, the ones that we're talking about here with Millsap going to the Nets and Aldridge going to the Nets and DeAndre Jordan going to the Lakers. I don't think that they are going to play much of a role either. I was reading an article that most NBA front office people consider those guys all to be relatively washed up, especially Millsap and DeAndre Jordan. I mean, the Nets had the opportunity to play DeAndre Jordan in their series against the Bucks that they lost and chose not to. So that shows you how, and they had a lot of injuries. So that shows you how much they thought of DeAndre Jordan. So I don't expect him to play much of any role, especially considering that, you know, he's when he was at his peak, it was as a defensive player, rebounder, and anything like that. So he's going to be worse at those things, and he never was able to provide any offense really outside of dunks and layups. He's a poor free throw shooter. Obviously, he can't stretch the floor, so I don't know what he really provides to the Lakers. And as far as the Nets, I actually do think Aldridge could play some role. It's hard to say coming off of, you know, the heart thing and stuff like that, how much he'll want to play, how much they'll want to play him. But he does have some offense to be able to offer. He has some range to his jump shot. So that could provide an interesting piece for the Nets. But Paul Millsap seems like he really doesn't have all that much left in the tank. He didn't play a big factor for Denver at all last year or in the playoffs. So I think, you know, if people were going to get upset about the signings in the offseason, I would have gotten more upset about, you know, the ones that are going to be impactful, like Patty Mills probably taking a little bit less money to go to the Nets, or, you know, the Lakers getting Kendrick Nunn and Malik Monk for very cheap money. Those things I think are going to be far more impactful. And I get that there's the perception of, and I think it is fair that these two teams are, destined to meet in the finals, and that all these players are sort of ring chasing. And I don't like that either. But again, I think that story should have been more of a big deal a little bit earlier in the offseason as opposed to these signings, which I don't really think are going to play a big factor one way or the other.
Let me ask you this. You're a Celtics guy. Was P.J. Brown ring chasing in 2008? Was Eddie House ring chasing in 2008? This is the pushback I have, is that especially Celtic fans, and I'm surrounded by them because we're in Boston, are always criticizing every other team for doing this. But I go back as far as 1985. I mean, Bill Walton came here to win a ring. I mean, this is what players have done in this league for ever. So I don't really hold it against Patty Mills for taking less money to try to win another championship with the Nets, or Nunn or Malik Monk or whoever deciding they want to go join the Lakers. That I kind of push back on that, because this is what the sport is all about. It's like that in the NFL now. That many players on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers took less money to stay in Tampa. Veteran players decided to go there, whether it was Antonio Brown or Rob Gronkowski or Leonard Fournette, who was waived by Jacksonville, to try to win a championship. So it just seems especially when LeBron James is involved in it, it's the worst thing in the world. But when everyone else is involved in it, it's, business as usual.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly happens before, but I think that this is a much more blatant example of it. I think especially with Monk and Nunn, I think it's so unusual for young players off of this is their second contract to take a very little money to try to win a championship. Usually you see that happen with veteran players and they've made their money in their career. And then they say, okay, well, I've made plenty of money. I'm going to try to win a championship. This just seems like a different sort of way to go about it. And I think, especially Sap, it's more, it's sort of more, not necessarily blatant, but I think it takes on a bigger meaning when we had the playoffs that we had last season and the finals that we had last season, where everybody was like, hey, this is great, fresh blood. The Bucks sort of did it the right way. The Suns did it the right way. And everybody was happy with that. And then literally a month after the season ends, you have these two super teams just continue to add and add and add, and nobody else really looks like they're getting, improving all that much.
Was the league happy though, where the ratings were 50% what they were when LeBron was taking on Golden State for 4 straight years? Like, the league would benefit from a Nets Lakers finals, right? I mean, that would be highly rated as compared to the Bucks and Suns, which was poorly rated. So we're basketball junkies, so we're watching whoever's in the finals. I mean, if it's Denver against Atlanta, we're going to tune in and, do our podcast. But the fan that's a passing fan is going to look at it and say, Denver, Atlanta, so what? Or Phoenix, Milwaukee, but Lakers, Nets, I'm going to get involved because of the star power. So, I mean, the ratings were down, and they have been down the last 2 finals. And part of it is because of COVID and how the schedule was truncated, and now you're playing the finals this year in July. Last year the finals were in October. I mean, it's kind of, people like routine. Like, the June should be the NBA finals, which we're going to go back to that in 2022. So I think You'll see a bump in the ratings there. I mean, people do get set in their ways. You wouldn't want to have the Super Bowl being played in April. It would still get great ratings, but it might be a little bit out of sorts for people. So I think that obviously the league would benefit from a Nets-Lakers finals with the star power. I'm not saying that the other finals that could happen wouldn't be engrossing. They would be. I thought that was a pretty good playoff series between the Bucks and the Suns in the finals. And I think getting there, the Bucks road was interesting. They needed 7 games to beat Brooklyn in the second round. That's still the one series that really stands out, doesn't it? Because it went 7 games and it went to overtime in game 7. And it became, a shootout at the OK Corral between Giannis and Kevin Durant, even though Kevin Durant went scoreless in the fourth quarter. So in the overtime, actually, it was kind of I believe Milwaukee outscored the Nets 4-2 in overtime, which isn't exactly a shootout at the OK Corral.
Right.
More like an extra inning baseball game between the Red Sox.
Well, there were a lot of shots. They just didn't, hit their targets.
They didn't go in. They didn't really connect on anybody. It was.
I don't know exactly if the shootout at the OK Corral, how accurate they were either. So
I don't know. Yeah, it could have been
a comparison, Sep.
Yeah, might have been a lot of misfires. But yeah, you get my point though, that the league would benefit from that. People want to see LeBron, whether they like him or not. He's the most polarizing star in the league. Durant and Steph Curry are the second and third biggest stars in the league. So, the league would benefit from all that. But I just push back a little bit because this has been going on in the league. When Bill Russell was playing for the Celtics, old guys would come here to ring chase with Bill Russell, and that seemed to be okay.
Yeah. Here's what the counter I would have to that, Sap, is
because it's not the Celtics. That's the counter.
Well, yeah, that's part of it. But
I mean, if Patty Mills had a good relationship with Ime Udoka, who coached him in San Antonio, and said, "I'm going to go to Boston and have a contract that's less when I could make somewhere else," you would obviously embrace this, right? Because Patty Mills would be a nice fit on this team.
Well, the Celtics, wouldn't have been the favorites with or without Patty Mills.
True.
The Nets were the favorites and they added him. So I think that, that's a difference right there. And on top of that, Sap, I think that, yes, I agree. If this is the finals, which I believe it will be, then the ratings would go up for the finals. But I do think that the inevitability that this is the finals takes away from what the ratings will be in the regular season. And so, on a micro basis, yeah, I think that the finals would do better with that for sure. But on a more macro scale, I do think that because everybody just assumes Lakers Nets, I think that a lot of these games that are going to be put on TV, people go, whatever. What's the point of watching this matchup? I know what the finals is going to be anyways. So when the league is more wide open, I do think that the regular season gets better numbers. When it's more inevitable, like when we saw with Golden State Cleveland 4 years in a row, I would venture to guess that the regular season ratings were down slightly. So I don't think that this is good for the league, especially like you said, okay, Bill Walton, certainly that's, ring chasing, something like that. But I do think that the volume of guys, whether they're still impactful or not, who are well-known names, that affects people's perception of what this regular season is going to look like. Like you and I both watch basketball. We watch every game for the most part. We know Paul Millsap and DeAndre Jordan don't have very much left in the tank, if anything left in the tank. However, they are both former All-Stars. People know who they are. And the fact that those names are going to these teams, I do think affects people's perception and their willingness to sort of be engaged in the NBA regular season.
Yeah, I mean, and in the end, DeAndre Jordan's probably the 14th guy on the Lakers. Rajon Rondo's the 13th guy, and wherever Millsap fits in with Brooklyn, they're not quite as deep as the Lakers. It seems like the Lakers, just got two of everything in the offseason. It was like Noah's Ark. Like, let's get 2 point guards, let's get 2 centers, let's get 2 swing men, let's get 2 wings. They just added everything, and Brooklyn has had a pretty good offseason as well. But look, you still have to go out there and win these games. If those two teams are healthy at the top, not at the bottom of their rosters, but if LeBron and Anthony Davis are healthy, the Lakers are the favorites in the East. And if Durant and even one of those other superstars is healthy, whether it be Harden or Kyrie or both, they'll be the favorites in the East. I mean, that's a given, and we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, and I think that it's also not just that the teams are signing these guys in the offseason, but it's the fact that neither one of them is particularly well liked, in the first place. With the Lakers, it sort of makes sense. No one outside of, Lakers fans like the Lakers. There's nobody who's just like, oh, yeah, it'd be nice to see the Lakers win it. And the Nets, because of the way they built it, no one's rooting for the Nets. Kyrie can delude himself into last year. He said, everybody, we're, playing for the world. Like, we're putting the world on our back. Everybody wants to see us win. He thinks whatever he wants to think. That's wrong. But because of, Kevin Durant and Kyrie kind of conspired to go to this team. James Harden ate his way out of Houston. Blake Griffin essentially faked being completely washed up while he's in Detroit in order to get bought out. And since it's just not a likable team in any way, shape, or form. And then the Lakers are, the Lakers. And you can say the same sort of thing about Anthony Davis, and that it wasn't necessarily the greatest way ever that he decided to oust himself from New Orleans to get to LA. So I think that a lot of people aren't thrilled with AD, especially prior to him joining the Lakers. So, if this was, say, the let's just say the two finals teams that it was last year, the Bucks and the Suns, even if they had, these massive off seasons where they added, I don't think people would be as upset because those two teams are much more likable than these two teams.
Yeah, I mean, they're also fresher, right? I mean, we hadn't seen the Bucks in the finals for 50 years, and we hadn't seen the Suns in the finals for 28 years. The Lakers are still the biggest brand in basketball by far. I mean, so people either love or hate them. They're the most polarizing team in the league, and they have their best player is also the most polarizing player in the league in LeBron. There are those that love him, like I'm in that camp, and then there are a lot of people that don't like him. So yeah, whatever they do is going to be blown out of proportion, but it's going to be interesting to see, and also interesting to see what happens because we're 3 weeks away from training camp. So there's kind of a lull right now, but there'll be some moves potentially made as we get into training camp or while we're in training camp just before the season starts. And again, we've talked about it ad nauseum about Ben Simmons, where he's going to end up. And I have a new, conspiracy theory, which would be a great, great move for both teams. It's not going to happen, but I'll let
All right,
you hear
Sap,
me.
how does he get to the Lakers? That's my guess.
He's not going to the Lakers. They don't have enough to give up. How would this deal work? Okay. Now, DeAndre Jordan went from the Nets to the Lakers. DeAndre Jordan is a close friend of Kyrie Irving. When Kyrie Irving was putting together the Brooklyn Nets a couple of years ago, was Durant,
conspiring,
Kyrie Irving, and that's okay. This is what happens in the league. The players have incredible power, and I support that. But it was Durant, Kyrie Irving, and DeAndre Jordan. That was the big three, even though we all knew DeAndre Jordan never really should be part of a big three. He was a niche player, really good defensive player, rebounder, but he gave you nothing on offense, as you said, poor free throw shooter. So he's close with Kyrie Irving, and now they move on from DeAndre Jordan. As you said, they didn't even play him against Milwaukee in the playoffs last year when they probably should have, because you're trying to build a wall, to impede Giannis. Will put a former defensive player of the year out there, even if he's a little bit washed up. He's a big person, a presence. They never used him. But now he's gone. Does this piss off Kyrie Irving, who we can never really tell when he's pissed off, if he's pissed off, why he's pissed off? How would this move make? It probably would never happen. Kyrie Irving from Brooklyn to Philadelphia for Ben Simmons straight up. The contracts would work. And I think both teams would improve making those moves, because could you picture Kyrie Irving with Joel Embiid? That would be spectacular. And just think of Ben Simmons with Kevin Durant and James Harden, exactly what the Nets need, which is a defensive player, good rebounder, outstanding playmaker. I mean, it would help both teams. I just couldn't see it happening, because if one of those two teams went on to win the championship, the other team would look foolish because they helped that team win a championship. But to me, that would be a fascinating move. Kyrie to Philadelphia for Ben Simmons.
I love that. I mean, I think that I agree with you. It would improve both teams immediately. I think Ben Simmons would be a tremendous fit in Brooklyn, because he would have no pressure to score the ball. Mm-hmm. I mean, he has two of the best scorers of all time, really. Right. I mean, that's not hyperbolic. Harden, say what you want about him. He's one of the greatest scorers of all time. And we already know Kevin Durant is. And Brooklyn's biggest hole is defense. And he brings, we think is, maybe the best defense in the league. So I think it would be a great fit there. And what has Ben Simmons failed to do in Philadelphia is, take scoring pressure off of Joel Embiid and, play in the clutch. And Kyrie Irving is, again, I don't like to compliment him. He's my least favorite player in the league, but he can score and he can play in the clutch. I know those two things. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, I think it would be a great trade for both teams, Sap. I hadn't even thought about it. I think it would be tremendous, but there's the two factors that play into it. The first one, as you said, because those two teams are in the same, not even the same conference, they're in the same division. There's an unwillingness to sort of work together, because, if one team goes on to win the championship, which one of them likely would, then the other team looks foolish for helping them out. And there's the Kevin Durant factor too, where he just signed, the big extension in Brooklyn. And I certainly don't think they want to piss him off, because he could go, he could just shut down and say, well, I'm not going to play for you guys anymore. I don't care that I just signed the extension. I have, $500 million in the bank. Trade me. I don't, it doesn't matter to me. So because Durant and Kyrie are so close, for whatever reason, Durant appears to be hypnotized by Kyrie Irving.
A lot of people are.
Yeah, a lot of people are. That's the main impediment, I think, to it. Even more so than the rivalry between the Sixers and the Nets factor of it is the Kevin Durant factor of it. But from a basketball standpoint, I agree with you. I think it improves both teams, and it would be tremendous value for the Sixers to be able to get Kyrie Irving for Ben Simmons, especially at this point when they're struggling to get like CJ McCollum for Ben Simmons.
Yeah,
To
I
be
mean,
able to get Kyrie Irving would be, I mean, that'd be an A. I'd give that grade an A plus for both teams.
just picture Kyrie Irving with Joel Embiid. That would be insane. And just picture Ben Simmons playing alongside Durant and Harden. He's the perfect guy for them because he gives them all the things they don't have. The contracts work. We know Daryl Morey, the general manager of the 76ers, is ready, willing, and able to make big deals, right? He brought in Chris Paul, and then he brought in Russell Westbrook to Houston. He traded for James Harden, half a decade before that. He's not afraid to make big moves. That would be one of the biggest moves in the history of the league. I mean, one for one trades, I always find fascinating in any sport. Like when I was a young man, and this is going back 40 years ago, two of my favorite players in the league were Paul Westphal, who played for Phoenix, and Dennis Johnson, who played for Seattle. They were traded for each other. And, that was a huge trade at that point. The DJ at that point was 26. Westphal was closer to 30. So Westphal was more on the back end of his career where DJ was right in his prime. The trade worked out better for Phoenix, but they didn't go ahead with a championship. Neither team even
Right.
made it to the finals after that deal was made because Magic Johnson and Kareem and the rest of the Lakers dominated the West for a decade. But that was a huge trade. This would be even bigger because these two guys are bigger stars. Well, at least Kyrie's a bigger star. Ben Simmons could be a transformational type player if he ever gets his act together. I just found it fascinating. Look, nothing surprises me in the league. I mean, if we do hear this from Woj one day that, there's talks going on that this potentially could happen, I wouldn't be shocked. I'd be surprised. But, the NBA is the one league where you say, star for star can happen. You generally not going to see this in the NFL. Like Patrick Mahomes is not going to get traded for Josh Allen. I don't think Kansas City would do it. And it's just, it's too complicated because you kind of built your system around that quarterback. But in the NBA,
Yeah, I can only remember one star for star player off the top of my head in the NFL was Clinton Portis for Champ Bailey is the only one I kind of remember off the top of my head. And I mean, I've been watching football for 25 years. So that's the only one I can really remember.
Yep, that was the big one. Again, a cornerback for running back. It was kind of a weird deal, but it seemed to. I think it worked out better for Denver because Champ Bailey's a Hall of Famer, and Clinton Portis was I would always take a corner over a running back, especially now when that trade was made. Maybe not so much, but give me the corner over the running back. Their career should be a little bit longer, and their position is more important.
Yeah, I agree, and it did work out better for Denver. I mean, Clinton Portis was a fine player, but Champ Bailey, like you said, is a Hall of Famer. But yeah, they're very rare in the NFL and the NBA. Typically, when you see a trade for a star player, it's a disgruntled star player,
right?
So you're taking, you're taking 50 cents on the dollar. You're trying to get picks and young players. So it's very rare to see an all-star for all-star swap straight up because it kind of everything has to come together where it makes sense for both the teams. The guys aren't necessarily happy in their current situation. Yeah, it just doesn't happen very often. I'm trying to even think off the top of my head the last time I can remember something like that happening.
Yeah,
one for one deals
doesn't happen. Generally happen. I mean, baseball.
I mean, Westbrook and Wall got swapped for each other last year, but they both it was more contract centric than player centric.
Right. Yeah, both bad contracts. I mean, we always heard this thing that the Red Sox were going to trade Ted Williams for Joe DiMaggio, and it never happened because in different ballparks, Lord knows what numbers they would have put up if Williams had played at Yankee Stadium and DiMaggio had played at Fenway Park. It's risky. That's the problem with it, especially imagine Kyrie and Ben Simmons. We're talking about two guys who, to put it mildly, aren't the most stable guys. I mean, we don't even know how they would react to a trade. I mean, this isn't like Russell Westbrook, he gets traded. I think he gets angry and he tries to play better. Like, I don't know what Kyrie would do if all of a sudden he got traded away from Kevin Durant, and Lord knows what Ben Simmons is thinking anyway. You'd need Sigmund Freud to figure him out. So, yeah, it would be a risky move. Like I said, if Kyrie goes to Philly and they win the championship, then the Nets look like fools and vice versa. If the Nets win the championship with Ben Simmons, it'd be a risky move, but it sure would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as a basketball fan, I love it. I think, like you said, Sap, it's a rare trade that would improve both teams, because they each lack what the other has.
Right. Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, it would be great in terms of it realistically happening. I don't think so, because for, the Nets, they obviously don't want to piss off Kevin Durant, and the Sixers are not operating in a position of strength at all right now with Ben Simmons.
Mm-hmm.
So the
Right.
Nets could say, yeah, he would improve our team, but also, the rest of the market is not very attractive for you right now. So, throw in 3 first-round picks too, and then maybe we'll be talking.
Yeah. Be
So
interesting.
that's why, again, we've talked about this a lot this offseason, because it's an interesting story, and we'll continue to talk about it. That's why the situation with Ben Simmons in Philadelphia is so interesting, is because Philadelphia has kind of got their backs up against the wall. Ben Simmons has been non-communicative, other than to say, I want out. And so what's going to end up happening is fascinating, especially because, we look at, when we did our list of top 10 players, we both had Joel Embiid very high up that list, so depending on how the Simmons thing shakes out, it could either make the Sixers legitimate title contenders or set them back. I just don't know how it's going to play out.
Yeah, and it's only 3 weeks from training camp, and he says he's not reporting. So something could happen in the next 3 weeks, or, he forces their hand at that point. But, yeah, we're not that far away from the start of the season, and Ben Simmons is still in limbo.
Yeah. So we'll obviously continue to talk about this as the season continues to approach. And when it does happen, and I think we both feel like it is inevitable that he's going to get moved, we'll certainly break all that down. Sap, I know you had an interesting poll this week that I actually immediately participated in. I think I was the first to vote and comment on the poll. You were talking about different all-time draft classes in the NBA. 3 in particular: the 1984 draft, the 1996 draft, and the 2003 NBA drafts. And the poll you put out was asking pretty simply, which one was the best one? Do you have the results of that poll, or do you want to break this down first?
The results as of now at John Sapp 25, 50% say the 84 draft, which of course was Michael Jordan, Hakeem Olajuwon, Charles Barkley, and John Stockton, all Hall of Famers. Only 10% picked the 1996 draft, which had Kobe Bryant, Allen Iverson, Steve Nash, and Ray Allen, all Hall of Famers. And 40% picked the 2003 draft. A lot of times in these polls, the most recent answer gets the best results, because that's what people remember and that's what they've witnessed. The 2003 draft obviously has LeBron, Dwyane Wade, Carmelo Anthony, and Chris Bosh, all either in the Hall of Fame already or will be in the Hall of Fame. So each of these drafts have 4 Hall of Famers. So 50% picked the Jordan draft, 10% the Kobe draft, and 40% the LeBron draft. I think at the top end, the 84 draft has to be the best one, because you've got Michael Jordan, Hakeem Olajuwon, Charles Barkley, and John Stockton. I mean, I go as far as ranking, the top players in league history. I have Jordan at number 2, Hakeem at number 14, and Barkley at number 18. I have John Stockton as a top 50 player. I tend to underrate him without question. I think he gets somewhat overrated. I think Steve Nash was a better player historically. Chris Paul, Russell Westbrook, James Harden, all better than John Stockton. But nonetheless, he's still a top 50 player. Just don't listen to him about the vaccine. But nonetheless, he's a Hall of Famer. He's the all-time assist leader. That's
knocked him down my list as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. He was in the top 40. And then when he started spewing nonsense about the vaccine, I dropped him about 10 spots. 96, you have Kobe, Iverson, Nash, and Ray Allen. Now, I have Kobe as the 9th greatest player ever. I have Iverson right around 30. Nash is a top 40 player, and I'd say Ray Allen's a top 60 to 70 player. So it's just not as good as the 84 draft. 03, you've got LeBron, who I have as the greatest player ever. I mean, you're going to disagree with that, but you probably have him at number 2. I have Dwyane Wade as a top 25 player. Carmelo, top 40 to 50 player. And Bosh, I'd say 70 to 80 player. I mean, I'm not even really sure about that. Yeah, I mean, Bosh is going to the Hall of Fame, but then again, so does everyone else. So, no question, 84 is the most talented draft at the top. But the thing about 96 that's interesting, Jet, is the depth of the draft, right? So you had Stephon
Marbury. That's what I said about that.
Yeah, you had Stephon Marbury.
It's incredibly deep.
Peja Stojakovic went 14th. Jermaine O'Neal had a really good career. Antoine Walker was the 6th pick in the draft, had a nice career, won a championship in Miami. compare that to 84. The next best players after this, top four, were Otis Thorpe, Kevin Willis, Sam Perkins, Jerome Kersey, Alvin Robertson. Those were all nice players, but, the guys from 96 were better. And the 03 draft is just not deep at all. I mean, the only two players that I could find in that draft were David West and Boris Diaw, who both had nice careers, but they're not going to sniff the Hall of Fame. So I would say 84 at the top was the best draft, but in terms of depth, 96. But also, Jet, I will say this. In terms of impact, now Jordan's the most impactful player ever, especially off the court, with Nike. He's still the most popular athlete in the country. But in terms of playing style, I think the 96 draft was the most impactful. Iverson is a player that so many of the players today love. And if they don't love Iverson, the only guy they love more is Kobe. I would say if you polled the current players, the two most popular players among them in terms of all-time greats were probably Iverson and Kobe. Right, more so than
I 100% agree.
Still in the league. Those are the two guys. Like Westbrook's favorite player was Iverson, and Jason Tatum's favorite player is Kobe. And I think if you polled most of the players in the NBA, those guys finished 1-2. Nash, incredibly impactful. I mean, I think Nash kind of led you to Steph Curry. Right, Ray Allen is a guy that you look at and say, man, imagine if he was playing today, how many three-pointers would he hit? You've got a reasonable facsimile of Ray Allen in the name of Klay Thompson. So I think it was a more impactful draft than 84. Jordan, look, is a freak. I mean, there hasn't been anyone like Jordan since, closest being Kobe. Olajuwon, a big man who is incredibly athletic. I think the big men today kind of look at Hakeem as the guy that they'd like to be like, but they really can't be, with the exception of maybe Embiid, whose game is somewhat similar to Hakeem's. Barkley is a player who, to me, is dated. As great as he was, his style of play doesn't fit into today's NBA, right? So I think in terms of impact, 96 was more than 84, but 84 was more talented at the top. 96 also was deeper.
Yeah, if do you think if Barkley played today, he would be a good three-point shooter?
He'd figure it out. I mean, he'd get better at it. First of all,
because that's what he'd have to do.
He'd have to do it 6'4", 6'5". Well, actually, at 6'4", 6'5", he could be what Zion Williamson is. I mean, he's a little shorter than Zion. I don't know if, he's as good an athlete as Zion.
Put the ball on the floor and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was a great passer, but he never took it seriously, which I think, if he could have it to do over again, that, he would have taken conditioning more seriously. And, if he had the work ethic that Karl Malone had, he would have, blown Karl Malone away. I still think Barkley's slightly better than Karl Malone career-wise. If you kind of look at it objectively, though, which I don't always do that, Malone probably had better numbers than Barkley, right? He won 2 MVPs. Barkley won 1. I think the mailman scored more points, had more rebounds, had a longer career. But yeah, Barkley would have had to adapt his game, but I think he would have figured it out. That's why I always think these guys would find a way to feel like Kobe would have become a better three-point shooter if he was playing today. Michael Jordan would have been a better three-point shooter if he had to play in today's era. They would have figured this out.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the more reps they would have gotten it. So yeah, I mean, when I voted in this poll, Seth, that's what I said, too. I think in terms of top tier talent, 84 for sure. And then the depth is 96. And I honestly think 03 tends to get overrated. I mean, obviously LeBron, you could make a case he probably is the greatest number 1 overall pick of all time.
Him and Kareem would be the two that come to mind.
So, I mean, there you have that, obviously. And he's bare minimum, I'd say a top 5 player of all time. I think he's
I'll disconnect with you at this point. I didn't hear that.
Player of all time.
I didn't hear the top 5.
There are some people. I didn't hear. I mean, Sap. There are some people who legit think Russell and Kareem. Some people put him.
They're the big four.
Over
they're
LeBron.
The big four. That's the Mount Rushmore.
Okay, so I'll say at worst he's a top 4 player of all time. Does that make you feel better?
That's better, yeah. Because 5 is Wilt. Magic is 6, Bird 7. I'm not going to give my top.
Okay, so I'll say at worst he's a top 4 player of all time.
At the very worst, and again, I don't know how we can compare LeBron and Michael to Kareem and Russell. I mean, 2 different positions, 2 different sports, really. When you talk about it, but I know, and the connection is beautiful. I still sound really good. I was just kidding.
There we go. So, but I do think after that, obviously, LeBron, take that away. So if you're going to take LeBron away from from the 2003, take Jordan
Right.
8 from the 84, take, I guess, Kobe away from the 96. You're left with, I am, in terms of Bosh, Carmelo, and Wade, I think they're all overrated.
Even Wade?
Even Wade.
Even Wade?
I have him as a top 40. You have him as a top 25.
Yeah.
Part of it is I'll admit it. I can't see it clearly because I'm so biased with him. And I think that he was a dirty player.
He was.
And I think that, had LeBron not joined that team, I don't know what our opinion about Dwyane Wade would be, because he would have gotten he had accomplished the one title very early on in his career. And then I would venture to guess he very likely would never have reached the finals again.
No, because he never sniffed it after LeBron left. I mean, and by then he'd been in the league 12 years and he was beat up as well. I mean, because Wade played a certain
style. And after Shaq left too, I mean, they were constantly either not making the playoffs or first round and out. So
yeah, no,
I think he's a little overrated. I think Chris Bosh is overrated. I don't think he should be in the Hall of Fame. And Carmelo, I think similar to kind of what you were saying about Barkley, I think if he took it more seriously, he would be top no-brainer, top 40, 50 player of all time because he had the talent. But I don't think he ever took it seriously conditioning-wise, and he never took it seriously on the defensive end, which, again, and I say this too, listen, defense, it's hard, but if you have the offensive skills and athleticism like Carmelo Anthony did, you can play defense. That's why I knock James Harden so much too. Like, had he so chosen, James Harden could have been a good defender. Same with Carmelo Anthony. Like that, it's just an effort thing. They didn't put in the effort into getting better defensively.
You look at James Harden, and a big part of defense is hand-eye coordination and foot-eye coordination. He is at the highest level possible with those two things, right? You're not as good a ball handler, shooter, the way he gets to the basket with his footwork. I mean, James Harden's footwork is impeccable. He should be able to carry that over to the defensive end. Absolutely. That's why, when I talk about LeBron and Jordan and even Kobe, they all gave you that max effort on defense for the most part. I know that LeBron occasionally takes some time off defensively, and I think Kobe did, and hell, even Michael did from on occasion. But when it was needed, those three guys were all elite defenders. So, yeah, if you take the top guy out of each draft, 84 is tough to beat because then you probably have the next two or even three best players in Olajuwon, Barkley. I wouldn't go as high on Stockton. I probably do underrate him, and I've explained myself for that. I think he and Malone were, both overrated. But yeah, the next two best players out of these three drafts would be Olajuwon and Barkley, and then you can go to Wade and Allen Iverson. Pick either one. I think they're pretty comparable. But Nash to me is better than Stockton, and it goes from there. I mean, I think Carmelo historically is probably a little better than Ray Allen. I mean, I like Ray Allen's game because it was so compact and so efficient.
Yeah, and one worked a lot harder than the other one did.
Oh, in terms of conditioning, oh my Lord. I mean, there's nobody that, LeBron, and Kobe and Michael were all great conditioned athletes, and Ray Allen may have taken it to another level. I mean, the man has not eaten a cheeseburger since college, which I don't know.
Yeah, he came from a military background too.
Yeah, he got the most out of what he got. Absolutely. So I think, but let me just really just detail some of the bad picks in these drafts, and this is what makes it so interesting. Yeah, you go back to '84. Sam Bowie went second, just before Michael Jordan. Mel Turpin went sixth. That one really hurts. I mean, look at Portland. If they passed on Michael Jordan for Sam Bowie, they passed on Kevin Durant for Greg Oden. Like, how different would the history of the Portland Trailblazers be if they just made those picks? They were there
extremely,
for them.
But I'll say this, Sep. When the Durant draft happened, 2007, nobody was saying pick Durant one. I know Danny Ainge said, I had Durant at number one. That's bullcrap. So
no, it was Oden. It was all about
Oden. In retrospect, okay, it looks terrible. You can't argue with that. I wasn't alive in '84, Sep. Was the consensus that Bowie should have been picked that high? Because with the Oden, I can ding him because obviously it was a mistake. But at the time, no one was going to pick Durant first over Greg Oden. No one was going to do that.
No, I mean, because it was still a sport that was dominated by who at that point? Shaq was still really good. Tim Duncan was really good. So you had big guys that were dominant, and you said Greg Oden's the next person on that list, right? Like you go Shaq, and I know that Duncan is a power forward, a stretch four, whatever you want to call him. He's not a classic center, but he's a big. And then you're going to go to Greg Oden is going to be the next guy. And all we kept hearing about were the comparisons to Bill Russell, which is always foolish. There aren't Bill Russell's just coming into the league every 5 years. Doesn't happen. So yeah, no, I could see that where you're going to go with the big man. I remember when the Celtics lost that lottery, it was like, they're not going to get Greg Oden. That was the guy they wanted.
That was one of the saddest days of my life.
It was. Seth. I remember that. Yeah,
it was. I was like, they're just never going to be good. It's just never going to happen for them.
Same thing in 97 with Duncan.
Yeah.
I mean, it was supposed to be Tim Duncan, and it wasn't. It ended up being Chauncey Billups and Ron Mercer, and they should have kept Chauncey Billups, who went on and won a championship.
Should have kept both of them.
Should have just built from there, but Rick Pitino was always in a rush. I mean, Rick Pitino, definitely the guy who flushes the toilet while he's urinating, doesn't wait till he's done. But Sam Bowie was the second pick. The problem with Bowie is he had some injury concerns at Kentucky, but he was going to be the next Kevin McHale, like a better version of Kevin McHale, if you can believe that, like a taller version, a guy who was versatile, could play defense, could actually face the basket and hit 12 to 15 footers. He was going to be a great, great player, but the injuries derailed him. I think everybody was comfortable with Houston taking Olajuwon number one because, again, at that time,
was a no-brainer.
If a great center was available, you just took him. And even though Houston had Ralph Sampson, they built the Twin Towers with Sampson and Olajuwon. So I think that, Jordan went to number 3. No one thought Michael Jordan was going to be what he became. And LeBron, you kind of expected to be an all-time great, like, when we saw him in high school.
We knew who he was when he was a sophomore in high school.
Yeah, he was 16 years old. We were watching his games on TV. You kind of felt he was going to be, like Tiger Woods. You had an idea that he was going to measure up to Jack Nicklaus at some point. You kind of felt that LeBron could measure up to Michael. Michael was going to be a great player. I thought Michael Jordan would.
Yeah, I think people were like, "Oh, he'll be an all-star. He'll be a multiple-time all-star." Right?
At that point, the best in 1984, I'd say, the best two guard in the sport was probably Sidney Moncrief or George Gervin. Those were probably the two guys that would be like first team or second team all NBA. Like Magic was always first team all NBA is the point. And then Moncrief or Gervin were the shooting guard. And then Isaiah Thomas would be second team all NBA. Those were the 4 guards that dominated, the early 80s. I thought that Jordan could be Sidney Moncrief. Great defensive player. Maybe not a great outside shooter, but a guy who could score, rebound, tough, hard-nosed. I said he could be Sidney Moncrief. By the 4th week he was into his NBA career, you're like, nah, he's a little bit different. I mean, you could just see it right away. He averaged 28 games as a rookie.
Seth, do you think it was Dean Smith maybe held him back a little bit in college and was like, played more of a team game and was like,
which I think helped him,
he didn't. Yeah, but do you think that that's why he wasn't like such a no-brainer? Sure. Okay, this guy needs to be considered as the prospect of the draft because of the way that Dean Smith coached at North Carolina. And, he had, James Worthy was on one of those teams too with Jordan. And there was also, you could make a case. The Bulls team he went to was probably worse than the North Carolina team he was on.
Well, it's like Mac Jones is throwing to inferior wide receivers on the Patriots than he threw at Alabama, right? That's not being hyperbolic. He had 4 first-round picks in his junior year. I mean, his senior year, he had 2 first-round picks, but the year before he was throwing to 4 of them.
It's only 2.
Only 2, but you know what? There's probably going to be 2 more that come out of that class that are going to get drafted this year. It's like that's not being hyperbolic. Yeah, I mean, he played with,
including the guy who won the Heisman Trophy. No big
right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you can make a case. Mac Jones was the 9th best, member of the Alabama Crimson Tide last year, behind 2 wide receivers, a running back, 2 offensive linemen, some guys on defense. I mean, it's incredible, but. Yeah, I think you could look at it and say, well, Jordan never played with anybody as good as James Worthy till Scottie Pippen became Scottie Pippen. Like, not right away. Like, when Pippen went there in 87, he wasn't James Worthy. I think in the history of basketball, you probably rate Pippen slightly ahead of Worthy because of the championships and a better defensive player, whatever. But
when he went to the Bulls, Seth, I mean, that team was garbage. When
Jordan went there, it was a joke. Yeah. It was a joke. I mean, his first year, they got into the playoffs. I think they were 33-49. They lost to Milwaukee. They played the Bucks and Sidney Moncrief in the first round, lost 3-1. The next year, he ended up with a broken foot. Management was like, take the rest of the year off. He said no. He came back, and that's when he had the ridiculous playoff series against the Celtics. Got swept, but I mean, it was Michael Jordan and a bunch of other guys against an all-time great team, and he scared the hell out of them, especially in the first 2 games at Boston Garden. But in his rookie year, you just said, okay, this guy's just a little bit different. He was winning games at the end. He was making blocks. He was just, you could tell that this guy is special. And at that point, Portland's like, man, we should have taken him. And then the running joke was that, Portland said, well, we already have Clyde Drexler at the 2. Why would we take Jordan?
Right.
We need a center. And Bobby Knight said, well, just play him at center at that point. Because Bobby Knight thinks Michael Jordan is the greatest player ever. Like, it's not even close. But he felt that way in like 1984. When he was coaching him in the Olympic team. Right away, he was like, this guy is just different.
And, years later, the same mentality bit the Pistons in the ass in 2003, right, where they said, all right, we already have Tayshaun Prince. Let's not, we don't need to, and Richard Hamilton, we don't need Dwyane Wade or Carmelo Anthony.
Right.
And they had Rasheed Wallace, too. They said, well, we don't have as a center. We've Ben Wallace, but he's a little undersized as center. Let's get Darko Milicic instead of, Carmelo, Bosh, and Wade. I mean, they would have ripped off, I would assume, multiple titles had they taken any of those guys, Bosh, Wade, or Carmelo, added to that Pistons team. I think that the best fit would have been Wade because he I think he would have fit into Detroit really, really well. And they didn't have a natural, like score. Like Hamilton was a good scorer. Wade is a great scorer. So they would have been fantastic, but it was the same dumb thought process of, well, we already have this, so we'll take a flyer on. And Darko, man, I mean, what a whiff! And he got overhyped to the extreme, just way overhyped. I think part of it was that right around 2003 was when Dirk was really starting to cook,
right? And
people were like, holy crap, we need to hit on these European players. Like, we really missed out a couple of years ago on Dirk. We need to find the next guy from Europe that's going to be a can't miss. And, Darko was tall and had some skills, but it was in retrospect, just one of the all-time whiffs. It ended up costing Joe Dumars his job.
Yeah, they could have dominated the conference for a half a decade with that, or they could have very easily moved on from Richard Hamilton. If Wade showed right away what Wade became, you could say, okay, we'll move on from Richard Hamilton, or you just have a really deep team. You figure it out. Other than a team that has an established quarterback who's in his prime or young, you don't draft another quarterback. Like Kansas City doesn't need to spend a first-round pick on a quarterback, in theory, for the next 8 to 10 years. Now, you may want to take one in the 3rd round to develop and be a backup to Patrick Mahomes, or if you're Green Bay, you draft Jordan Love when Aaron Rodgers is 36, and maybe you think his play is slipping, and then he goes on and wins the MVP. That's a little bit different. In basketball, just draft the best player and then figure it out later.
Always.
Same thing in baseball. A lot of people are like, why did the Red Sox draft a shortstop? They have Xander Bogaerts. Well, they drafted a shortstop who's 18, who's probably 3 years away from being a major league player. And at that point, if they still have Xander Bogaerts, he may be playing left field, because I think Bogaerts could naturally transition to another position, because I don't think he's a real elite defensive shortstop. So you just draft the best player. You do that in basketball as well. Like, look, Houston did that, right?
Well,
they had Ralph Sampson. They drafted Olajuwon, and they did go to the finals within a couple of years. Jordan would have been a little better, but So you figure it out. As Bobby Knight perfectly said, play him at center. Drexler and Jordan, that would have been a lethal combination, because Drexler at one point was probably the second best player in the league for a couple of years.
Right. It's not baseball. It's not football where they're not, in basketball, you're subbing out of games,
exactly.
And you can play a guy. Nobody really plays just one position. No. Even then, nobody played one position. You have guard, you play him in the backcourt. Okay, he's a point guard. We can play him at shooting guard. It's not the end of the world. But
Pat Riley wanted 5 6'9" players on the court at the same time. He came close oftentimes with the Lakers. Like, he'd have Magic, Worthy, AC Green was 6'9". He'd put like Bob McAdoo out there at 6'10". Like, he wanted 5 6'9" guys that could do everything. And that's, basketball guys can fit in together. It's like this whole thing, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, I don't think they can work well together. They can figure it out. They're both talented enough. They both can be outstanding on the court together. And again, as you said, you sub out. You're not playing every single minute together. You put Brown on the bench, Tatum takes over, then you put Tatum on the bench, Brown takes over, and then, you work the minutes accordingly.
The last thing I want to say, Sap, just a quick comment again about the depth of this 96 draft. And we talked about the guys who are the Hall of Famers, Iverson, Ray Allen, Kobe Bryant, Steve Nash. But take a look at the guys who are either really good players or all-stars too.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned Antoine Walker, Steph Marbury, Sharif Abdul-Rahim, Marcus Camby was a defensive player of the year, very good player. Kerry Kittle's a very good player. Peja Stojakovic, multiple-time all-star, probably would be an even better player now. Jermaine O'Neal, you mentioned, really good player too. Zydrunas Ilgauskas, another multiple-time all-star. Tony Delk had a 50-point game. Roy Rogers was a solid player. Derek Fisher, we know what Derek Fisher was throughout his career. Really clutch player, won a bunch of championships. I mean, holy crap, the depth of this draft was insane. And by the way, he wasn't drafted, but Ben Wallace was in this draft class. And, we know he's just got to the Hall of Fame. They missed on him, but
an undrafted guy.
That's insane. No, I mean, all these guys who are good players.
Much deeper draft and more impactful in terms of playing style and how the players in that draft are embraced by today's players or impacted today's players in terms of style. Even Marcus Camby, who was the second pick in the draft, that wasn't a terrible pick. I mean, at the time, it looked like a good pick. And Marcus Camby had a nice career. Compare that to the second pick in 84, Sam Bowie. Again, a lot of injuries. And the second pick in 03 was Darko Milicic. Awful pick. So even the second pick in the draft was better in 96 than in either 84 03.
Again, with those two, you're looking at the guys who came really close to them after. Carmelo went number 3, Bosh went 4, Wade went 5. So all immediately after Darko. Jordan and Barkley went. Jordan went right after Bowie, and then Barkley went 3 picks after Bowie. But with 96, Iverson went 1, Camby, then Sharif Abdul-Rahim, and Stephon Marbury, Ray Allen, Antoine Walker. Camby wasn't that much worse than those other guys. I mean, Ray Allen's in the Hall of Fame, but I mean, it's not like, okay, right after Camby was Sharif Abdul-Rahim. I'd make the case that Camby was equal to Sharif Abdul-Rahim. I mean, it's not like he was head and shoulders better. And listen, 12 teams missed on Kobe Bryant. That's the outlier of this draft. Is that and Steve Nash at 15. But I mean, you can understand that because he was coming out of high school at a time when very few players came out of high school.
Yeah, because in 95, Garnett was the 5th pick in the first round out of high school, and he was a big. Kobe, of course, a 2 guard. And you look back, Philadelphia had the first pick in the 96 draft. I wonder how close they came or how much thought they gave to selecting Kobe Bryant, who was from Philadelphia, hometown hero. Maybe they just felt it would be too much pressure for Kobe, although, as we found out throughout his career, there was never too much pressure for Kobe Bryant. He embraced those moments. But imagine if Philadelphia drafted Kobe instead of Iverson. But I think they got a lot of mileage out of Iverson. He remains one of the most popular, if not the most popular athlete in the history of Philadelphia. After, say, Dr. J. I mean, Dr. J is still the pillar of the 76ers.
Yeah, but for the younger people, it's that they never saw Dr. J play, so it's Iverson.
One of your favorite players, right? I mean, you're in Boston, you love Allen Iverson. I mean,
he was my favorite player, growing up, non-Celtic, without a doubt. And I think, like you said, most of the guys in the league, I think, would say that it's him or Kobe. No one's going to say LeBron.
Those are 2 guys. No, because you can't replicate his game. Like, there's just not a lot of, there really aren't many. There's no 6'9", 260-pound guys with that.
No, he's a man without a country in that.
He is. He's Switzerland or whatever. We'll call him that, whatever. But yeah, I mean, there's just, like Kobe.
But he's not Switzerland. He's Mars.
He's Mars. Yeah, that's true. Actually, Earth. Yeah, he's not even. Yeah, I mean, there's never been the closest to LeBron was Magic, right? 6'9" point guard. Magic's probably 1/10 the athlete LeBron was. Or is.
Yeah.
LeBron's athletic ability is like Magic
LeBron could jump over Magic. That's
right.
That's the difference there.
Way better defensive player too. So that's why I always kind of laugh and also scored 8 points per game more. That's why when people go, "Oh, Magic's better than LeBron," I go, "Well, they're very similar, except LeBron's a much better defender, much better athlete, more durables, played longer, and oh, by the way, scores 8 points per game more than Magic." So I don't even know where their debate is, but that's another debate for another day. But I just thought it was fascinating looking back at this draft and all 3 of these drafts. But I think we're in agreement that 84 at the top is the best. But in terms of depth and impact, 96 is the best. And in 03 is slightly overrated, although the greatest player in the history of the sport was drafted in 03. But the other guys, I'm going to give you a little bit on Carmelo and Bosh being overrated. I won't give you Wade being overrated, but you bring up a good point. If LeBron doesn't go to Miami, does Wade have the one championship and just that, one finals appearance? Probably.
Right. Yeah, and the Bosh thing too, obviously with Bosh in Miami too. Does he make the Hall of Fame? I'd say 100% no. If he doesn't play on the Heat.
He had a really good. Well, we know how the Hall of Fame is, though. I mean, Mitch Richmond's in the Hall of Fame, and I'm not, shitting on him, but Mitch Richmond's in the Hall of Fame. Now I look and see, Chris Bosh was a 7-time All-Star in Miami. I mean, in Toronto, he had a nice career. So maybe that's the case. And now look, LeBron got Wade a championship. He got Bosh a championship in Miami. Now he's going to get Carmelo a championship with the Lakers. He'll take care of that entire.
Yeah,
class.
He loves his draft class. Maybe bring back TJ Ford wants to come out of retirement. There's some other guys who Mo Williams, his former teammate, he might want to come out of retirement too. We'll see. But
David West was in that draft class. Maybe he'll come out of retirement.
He won a championship with the Warriors.
State, and he would bring the average age of the Lakers down, actually, if he came to play.
Yeah, that's true. He probably would make them younger and more athletic. All right, Sap. No, it's a great question and a great discussion. I love talking draft classes. It's a blast. I always love that. So we'll continue to talk this offseason as the training camps do approach, and we'll keep an eye on any news that comes out. So make sure you stay tuned to our Twitters for all the latest show updates at JohnSapp25. He's also got those great poll questions that you should answer and at Jet Stryer. And you can find our podcast wherever podcasts are found. Just type in the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap. You'll see the logo right there. Click on it, subscribe, give us 5 stars, leave a comment, do all those good things, and find us on YouTube at youtube.com/JetStryer. All right, Sap, we will talk to the people later, and see everybody. Thanks for listening.